Welcome to episode 103 of the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I'm actually Scott Myers, screenwriter and blogger over at sellingyourscreenplay.com. Today I'm interviewing screenwriter Dan Benamor. Dan worked in development and is now a screenwriter. He has some great insight into the development process. As the head of development, he hired screenwriters, and he was the one that received incoming pitches from new screenwriters. So he's got lots of great advice from both ends of the equation as a writer and as an executive. So stay tuned for that. This podcast is brought to you by Final Draft, the industry-leading screenwriting software and recipient of a 2013 Primetime Engineering Emmy Award. From inspiration to fade out, Final Draft software helps you every step of the way. Visit finaldraft.com for more information or to download a free trial copy. If you find this episode valuable, please help me out by giving me a review in iTunes or leaving a comment on YouTube or retweeting the podcast on Twitter or liking it on Facebook. These social media shares really do help spread word about the podcast, so they're very much appreciated. A couple of quick notes. Any websites or links that I mention in the podcast can be found on my blog in the show notes. I also publish a transcript with every episode in case you'd rather read the show or look at something later on. You can find all the podcast show notes at www.sellingyourscreenplay.com/podcast, and then just look for episode number 103. A couple of quick updates. I continually build out the SYS script library. I just posted screenplays for The Savages, The Hudsucker Proxy, Let Me In, American Hustle, Wreck-It Ralph, and Midnight in Paris, and also the screenplay for Go. They were sent in by Richard Weiss, so thank you, Richard, for sending those screenplays in. It is very much appreciated. If you have a screenplay that you do not see listed in the script library, please do email it to me. The SYS script library is completely free. We have over 1,000 scripts in the library, many hit movies and award winners and television shows. All the scripts are in PDF format, so you can download them and read them on whatever device you use. Just go to sellingyourscreenplay.com/library. If you want my free guide, How to Sell a Screenplay in 5 Weeks, you can pick that up by going to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. It's completely free. You just put in your email address and I'll send you a new lesson once per week for 5 weeks along with a bunch of bonus lessons. I teach the whole process of how to sell your screenplay in that guide, how to write a professional logline inquiry letter, how to find agents, managers, and producers who are looking for material. It really is everything you need to know to sell your screenplay. Just go to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. A quick few words about what I'm working on. I'm still doing the rewrites on the spoof comedy I've been talking about for the last few weeks on the podcast. The basic structure seems to be roughly what the producers want, so now we're just trying to make it more visual and more gag heavy. It is a spoof, very much sort of in the vein of something like Naked Gun, so they want a lot of really visual gags. I think they're very afraid dialogue jokes and, witty banter, I don't think plays as well overseas internationally when you start to have to do translation, whereas these very visual gags, and Naked Gun is a real good example of that, where they're constantly, just doing these visual gags. It's very dialogue. There's the minimum amount of dialogue to really keep the story going, and that's really what we're going from here. So it's a matter of really cutting on the dialogue and really just trying to beef it up with some visual gags. So it's dragging on a little bit longer than I would have liked, but I do think these guys are committed to making the movie, and they're committed to try and make it as good as possible. So that's good. So I'll be spending probably the next couple of weeks, probably through December, just trying to really get this script nailed down. I'm still planning on launching my Kickstarter in early to mid-January, so I've been trying to look at as many Kickstarter campaigns as I can, just to kind of find out how they work and kind of get up to speed all that. In the next couple of weeks, I'll be writing up my the rewards that people are going to get from donating to my Kickstarter, all that sort of text and getting all that organized. As I mentioned, I pretty much have my teaser trailer. It needs a couple little tweaks, but I pretty much have that ready to go. So I'm on pretty good pace, as I said, to launch in mid-January. I met with the producer of the TV pilot that I'm developing with him. I mentioned this last week on the podcast. He is a movie producer, but he was also a musician many years ago. And so this TV pilot it's largely based on his life. So we met last week, last Friday, just to have a little chit chat. And really it was just me, almost like a podcast interview. I was really just talking to him and asking questions about his life in this particular time period and kind of what went on, who were the other people in his life, and just kind of what it was like. So it was actually pretty interesting, and I recorded the conversation and took a lot of notes, and should give me enough material to be able to write up the pilot. I'm planning on getting this written hopefully, in January. As I said, I'm finishing up that spoof, and that's what I told him. I said I'm trying to finish up this one script, so hopefully I'll finish that up, in December, and then January, hopefully I'll write this pilot up. All the material is already in place. I mean, just from talking with him, we got a lot of just talking him and spitballing some ideas around. We kind of have a very loose idea of sort of what this pilot is going to be, what the actual scenes are. So there's still a lot to be done, filling out the characters and stuff, but have a pretty good idea of sort of the basic structure of the pilot. It's only going to be 25-page pilot. So, and as I said, hopefully most of the material is kind of there. It's just a matter of condensing and kind of boiling it down. So hopefully it won't take too long to write that up. Anyway, that's what I'm currently working on. So now let's get into the main segment. Today I'm interviewing Dan Benamor. Here is the interview. Welcome, Dan, to the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I really appreciate you coming on the show today.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
So let's just start out with your humble beginnings in the film industry. Just take us back, and maybe even before you even started working or going to film school, just take us back to maybe your childhood. Were you always interested in film? Kind of how did you just get interested? And then take us through sort of your early beginnings in the industry and right up through your recent sale and options.
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably started for me similar to a lot of people. I saw a movie that was really, really bad. And I was like, I think I could probably write a better movie than that. And so then I just sort of, I think almost like as a lark, I bought like Screenwriting for Dummies. Like they had a book, like you actually could read, like Screenwriting for Dummies. So I read that, and then I wrote a script. And then I was actually going to be a psychologist for a pretty long time. And but I ended up creating like a double major and doing a screenwriting major, and then I went to film school, and just kind of it snowballed basically. But it started with just me going to the movies and seeing a really bad movie and being like, I think I could probably.
Do you remember what that movie was?
I do. I'm almost reluctant to say it. It was a movie called Two for the Money, and ironically, the guy who wrote that script, and I think it's now years later, having actually worked in the real industry, like I understand how the credit of the writer doesn't necessarily reflect what ends up on the screen, because that guy actually made Nightcrawler, which is one of my favorite movies. Which is like an incredible, I love that movie. So I think it was also a pretty telling lesson about, as a writer, you never know what's going to end up on the screen.
Yeah. Okay, so take us through your film school days. I know one of the things we've talked about several times is you, at the end of your film school, you actually did a feature film, and it sounds like you pretty much did everything from soup to nuts on this film, and you got into a couple festivals. So take us through that process. I think that's an interesting lesson for people to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I went to the Vancouver Film School, and basically I just wanted to get the most out of it I could. So while I was there, I just said yes to everything. And, because it was a multifaceted program where you had like directors and directors of photography and producers, makeup artists, and we were all sort of under the same roof. So it was very common that you would meet somebody and they would say, hey, I'm looking for a writer. I want to do a short. And I would just say yes to everybody. And so I did, they're definitely not all on IMDb, but at least 7 shorts that year. And then my cousin who lives in LA, he had called me and he said, hey, I want to do a feature, but very low budget. And I kind of have this basic kernel of an idea, and I sort of, I know I could get this one location. And so I said, okay, I'll help you out. And so I wrote the script for him, and he then called me back and he said he lost his job and he didn't have any money. And he said, so we can't make it. I said, well, okay, would you be cool with me making it? And he was like, yeah, sure. And so because I had done all these shorts, I sort of already knew the reason that I even had the idea was that I'm like, all right, well, I know a guy who's got a great camera. I know a makeup artist. I know, crew members. I know people that are trying to produce. And I sort of knew that I could just call all those people and be like, hey, do you guys want to, make a movie with me? And that's pretty much what I did. I mean, I actually, because I had never directed before, I figured I should probably direct a couple things first. So I basically did the same thing and called friends and did I think we did 3 or 4 shorts, just essentially just as practice, really. Mm-hmm. And then,
and this is in Vancouver as you're still a film student.
With all my film school friends and stuff. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, then I basically cobbled together literally, I think it was $4,000 total, maybe $4,400. And, that essentially paid for food, makeup, and I think some other just like basic expenses, but everything else was free. Nobody got paid. I certainly didn't get paid, and I pretty much just had to figure it out. So I did the casting, I found the location, I directed the movie, I wrote the movie, and I brought in people to help me. Like I had a co-writer, I had a guy who gave me a ton of help with the editing because I didn't know how to edit. I had a great director of photography, great actors. I was very fortunate that in Vancouver they got a pretty strong film scene, so that ended up being helpful. And yeah, we just like went to this. It was actually a lady that her son was going to play a kid in the movie, and I met with her to talk about it. And she said, how's it going? And I said, well, we had this location that fell through, so we'll see how it goes. We're hopefully we'll be able to nail down another one. And she said, oh, well, if you get in trouble, you can use my house. And I literally called her like that night, and I was like, hey, were you serious about that? Because we probably would actually do that. And she was like, yeah, sure. And so we shot at her house for like, I think it was like 3 weeks or something. Oh. And it was like an hour away, and we had to be out of the house by 4 o'clock because that was when the family came back from work and school and stuff. And and her kid, was great in the movie. But it was a brief part. I personally would not have actually asked her, hey, can we use your house, if she had not offered. Mm-hmm. And so it ended up being this thing. And anyway, so I edited the movie. I went back to America, edited the movie, moved out to LA, and I had heard about this festival called World Fest Houston. And so I sent it to them, and it got in, and they said, hey, we're going to we're going to show it in Texas, and we'll give you a hotel room, and you come down and watch it in the actual movie theater and stuff. And we won a little award, and it was cool,
Uh-huh. Now, how did you happen to hear of World Fest?
One of my professors at the film school, I had said, like, hey, I made this movie essentially for no money, what's some different festivals that are sort of open to these types of movies? And so she mentioned that festival, and I applied, and
mm-hmm.
There you go.
Did she have any in with it? Like, was it just a cold submission, or did she?
Yeah, no, completely a cold submission. Didn't know them or anything.
How many other festivals did you submit to? That was the only one?
No, I think I submitted to probably like 6 or 7. I mean, again, it's one of those things where, given the budget of the movie, the festival submissions would have outspent the budget of the movie had I sent it to too many more. So it was an interesting situation.
Yeah. I wonder if you can just pitch the idea. What was sort of the premise?
Yeah, it was.
That?
I mean, it's I think it actually turned out pretty well considering all the challenges we faced. It's so the movie was basically about these hitmen. They go to a house, and they're going there specifically to kill someone, but they don't know the person they're going to kill. They don't know what he looks like, and they go in, and they happen to go in just as another guy who's been painting the house is going in to rob the house. And so they accidentally kill the wrong guy. And then they discover that he was going to rob the house because there's like $1 million in the house. And then the guy they were supposed to kill shows up. And they can't really now, like, they have to decide amongst themselves if they want to take the money because they have a criminal boss that is also coming. And so it's basically this sort of confined scenario where all these like crazy, violent people end up interacting with each other. And, that's pretty much it.
Mm-hmm. So I one of the things that occurred to me when you told me about this film months ago is that it actually feels like a fairly commercial genre film. Yeah. Like it's kind of a thriller. And did your cousin have some idea that this might be something that was somewhat commercial of an idea? I mean, most people in film school, they make that film that's completely not commercial. Right. The art film, the passion project. And this is not. This is like kind of a genre film that you could see actually getting made and as on a low budget.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I really don't know. He just literally called me one day out of the blue, and he was like, yeah, I had this idea. And, that was sort of the seed of it. And then I just kind of took it and ran with it from there. But, I don't know why he gave that particular idea, but it worked.
Yeah. How many of these Vancouver friends have made it down to LA and actually had careers in the entertainment industry?
Well, so it's sort of stratified. So if you're a Canadian citizen, the Vancouver scene is active enough that you could really stay in Vancouver and have yourself a pretty nice career. So I think for a lot of them, they're still working within the Vancouver scene. And I mean, ironically, as I went forward in my career, most of the movies that I have developed and that got made were shot in Vancouver. So, for them, I think it ended up, especially being Canadian, there's visa stuff and different things like that. I just think a lot of them probably stayed in Vancouver.
Yeah. Okay, so let's kind of move on to the next phase of your career. You got to LA and you got this job at NASA Entertainment. Maybe you can take us through that process. What did you do when you first got to LA? I guess you knew your cousin. Did you have other connections through film school? What did you actually do when you first got here?
Yeah, no, literally the only person that I knew here was my cousin. And so I didn't know what to do. I mean, I figured I should do something within the film business. So I was an extra on like every TV show imaginable, and then I just applied to internships everywhere. And I had been a script reader in college. When I started getting interested in screenwriting, I reached out to a company that was like small and was just like I think was willing to let a lot of different people read. And so anyway, I had a little bit of experience as a script reader, and so I interned. There was a posting on like entertainmentcareers.net or something. So I applied for that as a reader and a coverage sample. And so I got a job as an intern remotely, just like they'd send me scripts and I would send back coverage. And then from there, I got an email saying, hey, would you be interested in coming in like one day a week and just, running the front desk and reading scripts? Yeah, sure.
And was this unpaid? You were doing this unpaid, or it was
an intern? Yeah.
Okay. And how do you approach something like that when you're clearly out of school? How do you say, well, I want to be an intern even though you're not in school? Because the whole idea with an internship is that you're getting like school credit.
Yeah, I mean, I later ended up running the interns, and it's not necessarily always school credit. I mean, obviously for some of them it is, and I definitely have filled out the forms for school credit and stuff like that. But for a lot of people, they just want the experience. So, I mean, I think that when I was in charge of the interns, I would say probably like 60 or 70% of them were not for school credit. They just genuinely wanted to have some sort of experience in film and wanted to intern somewhere. And, that was how.
Yeah. Okay. So take us through that job. You are now working one day a week at NASA Entertainment. Just take us through sort of what you started to do as your duties and slowly work your way up there.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was like the Wednesday intern. So basically, you answer the phone and you read scripts and you talk to the producers about what you think about the scripts. And that's pretty much what I did. And I think that, I just, for whatever reason, have strong opinions on everything. And I think that was probably what made me maybe stand out a little bit from some of the other people. And eventually they said, listen, we need like a development assistant. Would you be game for that? I said, yeah. And so they ended up hiring me to be the development assistant. And I was doing that for a while. And then eventually it just we got along so well, and it just sort of naturally morphed into, me taking on more and more responsibilities until eventually I was running development.
Okay. And so what is it on a day-to-day basis? What does the head of development at a company like this do?
So, when it's a smaller company and the movies are, I suspect it's probably the same even at a bigger company, but particularly when you're doing movies that are in independent film and smaller budgets, we had a pretty significant amount of different projects going at any one time. And basically every day you're just trying to move the ball down the field. So, you look at your spreadsheet or your grid or however you keep track of it and basically just try to say, okay, well, what can I do today to advance this project? So, maybe one thing is just an idea and I have to find a writer. And then, one thing, okay, the writer has delivered the first draft, but the first draft needs some work. So then I give notes and I assign it for coverage and talk to the other producers about it. And then, okay, let's say the script is actually, we think it's good. We think it's ready. So now we got to find a director. We got to start thinking about how we're going to package it with actors and stuff. Once you get a director, then it's time to go and try to look into casting, make offers. And then once you get some actors and a director, then you really start getting aggressive about, okay, how are we going to finance this? What distributors? All foreign sales, and all that type of stuff, getting a budget.
Yeah. So maybe too, you can just give a quick definition and maybe even list some of the titles. You're saying these independent films, just so people have an idea of what these were. Maybe just list some of the films that you worked on while you were there and, some of the cast members that might have been in them.
The stuff I worked on ran the gamut. The biggest, in terms of budget, film that I developed that ended up getting produced is a movie called American Heist. So that came out this year. It stars Adrian Brody, Hayden Christensen, Akon, and Jordana Brewster. And so that, I think, was close to 10 million or in that ballpark. And then I also, I worked on a string of, so for example, today I went to Walmart. 2 different movies that I was involved with are at Walmart still today, that are like Christmas movies. So I did probably between Christmas and Faith Friendly, probably like a half dozen of those. And those are usually on the lower end. I mean, probably, under 5 million. And then I did Westerns. And so basically, I mean, basically all of it under the roof of 10 million and sometimes significantly under that roof. And so, and then that also affects what kind of cast you can bring to it and, different things like that.
Yeah, yeah. So you're mentioning, okay, you go to Walmart, you see these films. Where else do these independent genre films end up? What other markets?
We're in an interesting place now. I mean, it's definitely occasionally if you have like a pretty good cast. So, for example, American Heist, I believe, did have a day-and-date theatrical VOD type of thing. But if you have if it's like a smaller, just kind of a programmer type of thing, it's really just a video and video on demand play. So you'll see it at Walmart. You'll see it at, to a lesser extent, places like Best Buy, Barnes & Noble, Target. But I think it's the bigger play is in the platforms and Redbox. So Redbox, iTunes, Amazon, any sort of video on demand provider. That's really, I think that's where it's all going anyway. But, for these types of movies, it's basically DVD and video on demand.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, so you mentioned hiring writers while you were the head of development. I wonder if you can give us a little insight there. How did you decide to hire certain writers? These are obviously not super high budget, so you probably didn't have access to the top writers at CAA. So how did you go about finding writers for a specific project?
Yeah, I mean, so to your point, it was definitely something where I was able to give a lot of guys their first credit, which is pretty cool. I was a writer before I got that job. So, what ended up working out kind of nice is that I knew a lot of people that I thought were really strong writers that just for whatever reason hadn't necessarily gotten the best opportunity yet. And so I was able to, I almost had my own Rolodex where I could just call them up and be like, hey, remember me? Like, I got this job. I think you actually legitimately would do a good job on this script. So, I want to hire you to write the script. And so that allowed me, I think probably half of the movies that I did, I already previously knew the writer in my own writing travels. And then the other half was a combination of contest people, like someone placed in a contest and I read their script, or, so I did have there's a produced script that I did through a guy I met through Inktip. So that was definitely one of them. So yeah, it ran the gamut, but it was all the sort of entry level stuff. So, either you did well in a contest, or I found you through Inktip, or some sort of equivalent to that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And you and I actually originally met I was blasting my scripts using my email and fax blast service, and you were on the receiving end of that. So maybe you can talk a little bit to that, just maybe some tips or some tips for writers when they're trying to approach this. Did you ever get cold calls? One of the things I recommend is cold calls, because a lot of people are afraid to pick up the phone, and it's nerve-wracking to do, but I've actually been in production companies where I've seen that actually work and stuff. So maybe you can just kind of talk a little bit about how those writers can get in the sphere of those heads of development and potentially get some of these jobs.
Yeah, we were open to receiving queries. I think in general, so for example, in your case, when you sent, I think, a fax and an email, and the first sentence was like, hey, I'm a produced writer. And so as soon as that is on the table, it's all about, I think, validating yourself as like not going to waste my time, basically, because the time is the most valuable commodity always. And so the concern, and I think this is where a lot of writers maybe like don't understand from the point of view of the other side of the desk, is that the last thing you want is to waste your time where you get a query or a cold call that leads to them sending you a script or whatever. And then you read the script and it's like, this was a colossal waste of my time. Like every piece of this interaction was a waste of time. And so whenever the conversation can start with something that validates the writer, so it's like, hey, I won this contest, or I'm a produced writer, or anything along those lines, I think that creates a comfort zone on the other side of the desk that, hey, at least I know the script's going to probably be decent. And so then you feel a little bit more comfortable that, you're not going to waste your time. And I think that's really the main thing.
Mm-hmm. How many cold calls would you get when you
Calls were rare. I think that for the majority it was email, or, we would occasionally get a fax. When somebody would call, it would usually be, hey, I have a script or whatever, and I would just explain, hey, we are open to looking at queries, you can send an email to this email address, and that was pretty much what happened.
Okay. How many people send faxes? One of my whole strategies, I figure most people are not sending faxes, and that's why I actually send faxes myself and wrap it into the email and fax blast service, because I feel like a lot of people don't send faxes
nobody
anymore.
sends, like 2 people, like you and and maybe like 3 other people send faxes. And
probably using my service.
and so, like, it would be one of those things where you're looking through the fax machine and you're like, what the hell is this? Oh, okay, it's query. Like, it definitely was not normative.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on a little bit and talk sort of about, let's see here, about some of the films that you worked on, and one of the things that we've had conversations about, and I think it would shock a lot of people, but we've kind of talked about the fact that these genre films, in a lot of cases, the script is not really all that big of a deal in terms of the ultimate success of it. And everybody always, especially writers, think that the script is essential. And for these genre films, I mean, you can't have a piece of garbage, but if it's kind of like a B plus type of a script, you're in pretty good shape. There's a lot of other things that can still go wrong, obviously. But maybe you can talk about why were some of these films more successful? Maybe talk about why some of the films were not as successful, just to get an idea of what actually shapes the sort of the success rate of these genre films.
Well, I mean, I think in general, obviously you're always trying to get the best possible product out the door. I mean, that certainly, that goes without saying. But I think that there's also a pragmatism to it where it's like, we want to make this sometime this century. Especially when you're working at lower budget ranges, you need to be producing, ideally, a larger volume of films. So it's sort of something where you try to pick the best writer you can, you try to put out the best script you can, but, at the end of the day, you're trying to get the movie going down the line. And that's sort of the main thing. But it's, it was one thing that was sort of interesting about it was that I actually think, it's sort of a complicated issue, right? So basically, if the script is not good, then it's more difficult for me to go and attach a good actor to it. And then that later is going to compromise the sale of it because it's not going to have as big of a name actor on it. At the same time, some issues that might seem to people like not as important, like different things about how you design the script in terms of budget, how much a certain role maybe plays in the script, the age range of certain roles, things like that are sort of not intuitive from a creative point of view. Those end up, just because of the way the business works, being really helpful down the line. So, for example, if I have a movie and there's a role for an older male actor, and that role is at the same location, so he's playing at the farmhouse or something. Every scene he's in is at the farmhouse, right? But he's in like 20 pages of the script, but he never leaves the farmhouse. But it's kind of peppered throughout the script. So, you can then go and make a more competitive offer to an actor because they're going to work a shorter amount of time. And then when somebody watches the movie, they're going to feel like, oh man, this guy is like a co-star of the movie. I mean, it's like a really prominent role, but you've saved yourself an impossible amount of headaches by having it be one location. You can shoot them out in a relatively short period of time. And you've made things a lot easier for yourself from a production point of view. So that's one of the things that's like an example of where the creative part of it almost has nothing to do with it. Like, it's not creatively going to benefit it that he happens to be at the same location, but it is going to make it a lot more producer friendly. And so, there's sort of, sometimes there's just being aware of things that are just, helpful.
Yeah. And just to be absolutely clear, you're talking about the cast, getting a named talent, and if you only need him for 2 days, that means you can pay him a lot less.
Yeah, it's essentially the same role, right? And this is one of those things that I always want to stress to writers, because it's like you can have just as good of a script where he happens to be set up in a way you can shoot him out quickly. There's creative ways to be kind of clever about it and do that. And so then the same role that otherwise you would have had to pay that actor maybe 3 times as much because he would have worked 3 times as long. Now, if he's working much shorter, you pay him essentially, you can just you can pay him more money. I mean, really. But it's actually less money to the production than it would have been if the role was scattered over a dozen locations and you needed him for, a month or something.
And I think what people might not realize if they've never been through this is that, I mean, when Tom Cruise signs on to a film, he doesn't have a day rate. You're paying him some extraordinary amount of money, and it doesn't matter how many days he's there. when you're talking about these low budget films, you're literally, these actors that are doing these, they have a day rate. So if you need them for 10 days, that's 10 times as expensive as if you need them for one day.
Yes.
And it's maybe not quite as concrete as that, because these agents also realize that you're going to be putting them on the box cover. So there's probably is some minimums, and stuff. But the bottom line is you need to maximize whatever amount of days you have, is you need to maximize that use of it. Let's talk about the transition you went through from being a head of development to a screenwriter, and working full time. Since I've known you, you've optioned a couple things. You sold one script. So maybe we can talk about that transition, kind of how you made that transition. Did you just leap off a cliff, or was it a slow, gradual push?
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much leaped off a cliff. I mean, I really, I didn't have any job lined up. I didn't have anything going on. I just sort of, I had enough validation in my writing from people whose opinion I really, took a lot of stock in, that I felt that I had the skill set to do it. And, I think
you had not optioned or sold anything before you quit your job at Nasser.
No, I don't think so. I mean, it was announced in the Hollywood Reporter. I had packaged this movie that I co-wrote. It was a Scott Adkins, Randy Couture movie. And that was announced in the Hollywood Reporter, I think, like maybe, I want to say less than a year before I left my job. So I did occasionally help out, writing on stuff that we were involved in. And so anyway, I had seen that my writing was competitive within a professional arena. And so, I just felt confident that I could do it. And I had came out here originally to be a writer, and, I sort of fell into this job running development, and I definitely enjoyed it a lot. But I think that I always felt this sort of, like romantic call to just go write. And so, at a certain point I just said, screw it, let's do it.
Okay. So then what was some of the first things you did? You've given your 2 weeks notice. You've gone in for your last day. What were the things you did on those first couple of weeks or months that you're just basically writing full time?
I pretty much, I just try to be as aggressive about it as possible. I immediately started just generating material. I made a real point to, and I think this is actually how you and I, met in person. I basically reached out to every writer that I knew. And at that point I knew a lot of writers. Every writer that I considered relatively successful, had something produced or seemed to be having a lot going on or whatever. And I just invited them all to lunch, and I met with everybody, and I just asked them, what are you doing? And what would you do if you were me? And they all sort of had different advice. And so I tried to, I think that the thing that has allowed me to have most of the success that I've had has been referrals. So like, I know a guy who says, hey, Dan's good. Let's give Dan this, And I think that, it's something that you build it over time. So it's not even necessarily one meeting, like you have lunch, you check in 3-4 months later. Hey, you want to get a drink, and you kind of keep it going like that. And so then later when you say, hey, I have this script, it's a different type of relationship. It's not just like a stranger handing you a piece of material. It's somebody that you actually personally know and are friends with. And so I think that makes a huge difference.
Yeah. So did you during your ramp up, you knew you were going to leave your development job. Did you start to write a bunch of scripts? Like, did at least you have a stack of scripts you could start marketing?
So the script that I sold through Your Blast, I had written that on the side, like at night and stuff, like while I was still in running development. Mm-hmm. So that was one example of something where I was like, I probably will at some point transition wanting to just write full time, and I want to have some material in my hand when I do. And, so that was one thing that I did.
Yeah. One thing I found, and I'd be curious to get your take on this, and maybe that's why you just decided to go cold turkey and write full time and not have a job. One thing I found when I was doing production jobs was production jobs are incredibly time consuming. They're usually not that high paying, and they're usually, to work a 10 or 12 hour day it's fairly common that they expect you to work, long hours. So how did you find time to write on the weekends, especially doing development stuff? Were you tired?
Yeah, no, that was one of the nicest things about, obviously, it was inevitable that if I wanted to pursue it full time, I was going to have to do this just to have the physical time to write. Because most of the stuff that I would write outside of work, it would be where I would essentially plan up to it and then do it on a one weekend or something, just bang out, literally, I've done it in one weekend, like Friday, get off work, sit at the computer, don't leave until like Sunday, 1 o'clock in the morning. Like, I would do stuff like that. And so, yeah, it would just like, yeah, it was having that extra time to write has made obviously a huge difference in my ability to be productive.
Yeah. So, okay, so let's talk about that script that you sold through the SYS email and fax blast service. I know it's now sort of in pre-production, so maybe you don't want to give away some of the specific details, but maybe you can just give us a little bit about it, kind of tell us what it was about, the genre, the some of the budget range, just any kind of detail so we can get a sense of kind of what it is and what it was.
So, I mean, I basically, coming from my background, I knew I wanted to write something that had really strong roles for actors, that could be made on a reasonable budget and had some sort of genre dimension to it. And so I think I had watched Cape Fear for whatever reason one night, and I thought it would be interesting to kind of figure out a way to do a little bit of a twist on Cape Fear. And so basically that's essentially what I did. I mean, I figured out an angle. It's it's a story basically where these two men, they killed somebody together, and only one of them ended up going to prison, and the other one ended up having like a pretty nice life, like he had a suburban, comfortable life. Mm-hmm. And so when the guy who went to prison gets out, he comes to see him, and it essentially was something where we set out to write it, and we realized probably like third draft that the female role was like totally bland and like not interesting, and so we said, okay, well, how can we kind of flip this around and make it, and also create a bigger twist on Cape Fear, because that was sort of a familiar template. And so we had this idea that this guy would probably visit his criminal conspirator when he was in prison. Like he might actually be feel obligated to go see him. And so basically we came up with a scenario where he goes to visit this guy in prison, but he can't bring himself to go inside. And he sees a woman outside, and she also is visiting someone, and she can't bring herself to go inside. And they actually strike up a friendship and then end up falling in love and getting married, and they have a child. And when this guy gets out of prison, you basically find out that they both were going to see the same person, that she and him, they both were involved with this person, and they have hidden this from each other for years. And so everybody has these really complex, like, histories with each other that are fraught with bad stuff. So it's sort of a ticking time bomb, and hopefully gives the actors a lot of stuff to play with.
Yeah. And so it sounds very contained. Most of it takes place, in the house, this couple's house.
Yeah, I sort of I know what you can make for, $2 million and under. And so I sort of knew, okay, well, to have some sort of genre dimension, you still need some action. You still need some sort of production value. So you can't go super cheap with it. That's actually one thing that's a little bit counterintuitive, because if it's like literally just two people talking to each other in a house for 90 minutes, later when the producer goes to try to sell it in the foreign market and different things like that, you're not going to have a very strong trailer because you have no production value. You don't have anything, somebody shooting at somebody, a chase, a fight, an explosion. So we definitely incorporated some of that, but it's in a scale that is still something where it's very easy to do it in a modest budget. So there's a shootout, there's a fight, there's, it's a lot of stuff with just suspense and tension, which doesn't have to cost a lot of money. So it isn't just in the house, but it's just big enough that it will not feel cheap, basically, which was sort of our goal going into it.
Yeah. No, that's a good tip for sure. So talk about just the marketing of this script. Obviously, you have ultimately sold it through my blast service, but talk about some of the other angles you were using to market it.
Yeah, I kicked it around through some of my own professional contacts of other people that I knew in development and different things like that. What I ended up realizing is that I actually had, in a way, scaled it to a degree where it was actually slightly smaller than I had anticipated, because I probably could have, and now that it has sold, we are doing some rewrites to add even more action to it. But I basically kicked it around to some of my development contacts. I put it on Inktip, and then I sent it out through your blast service. And I actually, remarkably, through the combination of Inktip and your blast service, I think I've had, since we sold it, a couple more people have come back who I had sent the script to and said, hey, we're interested in acquiring this. Like, is it available? I'm like, no, we sold it already. So, I think I ended up having probably like 5 different buyers that were interested. But the producer who ended up taking it was a little bit more aggressive and basically said, hey, I'll just buy it from you, versus option. So that was why we ended up going with him.
Yeah. I'm curious what your contacts in the business said. They liked the writing, but it wasn't quite for them. What was the note you were getting back?
The main thing was that it was if I like was thinking about, okay, how would I do it in a bigger way, it would probably be more action based. That's one thing about it is like, and that's probably why we're adding more action to it now, is that we did it where it sort of hits this mix between drama and thriller. And so it has a heavy amount of dramatic elements. That's why I think we'll probably have, some good fortune when we actually go to actors with it. But it's tilted pretty strongly in that direction. So that makes it a little bit more challenging in terms of foreign sales and different things like that. So it does kind of gear itself as a sort of higher genre festival type of vibe, So I think that was the main note I think we got back, was that people liked it, but it was probably too much of a drama.
I see. And now you're turning it more like action thriller instead of drama thriller?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely still heavy on dramatic elements, but the thriller elements we're highlighting a little bit more. We're adding a little bit more sexuality to it. We're adding a little bit more action to it. So it will feel a little bit more genre-y, but I think still have that balance that is what we liked about it creatively.
Okay, cool. So the next thing I want to talk about, I thought it might be interesting to offer, producers' notes and basically get your insight on people's scripts. So this is something we've been talking about, and I just want to kind of describe what that service will be, and then we'll dig into some of the actual details. What we're thinking of is you're going to get a synopsis from a writer, and you're going to review the synopsis, and then you're basically all this stuff that you're talking about, sort of the practical production stuff, the producer's notes. You're going to then have a 45-minute telephone consultation with the people and give them all of your insight into how they can improve their script with sort of a practical, not so much on story structure or that kind of angle, but on sort of the practical angle of how they can improve their chances of actually selling this. We're still working out some of the details, but I'm going to link to it in the show notes. So let's talk about, maybe to start out, just talk about sort of the broad strokes of what this is going to be, and then we're going to talk specifically about one of the scripts that you wrote earlier in your career and why you made some mistakes and what those mistakes were specifically about that script. But just in the broad strokes, maybe you can kind of tell us what this product is going to be.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing, especially being a writer who then became a development executive and then went back to being a writer. So I had a sort of unusual path, and when I was a development executive, I was extremely sympathetic to writers, and one of the reasons that we started talking about this is because on your show, you often talk about how, like, if you are a writer and you're looking to break in, some of these smaller companies and movies where they're open to new writers, that's a great place to start. And so I was the guy that you would send that script to. I mean, I would accept queries and I would read scripts from new writers, and I was that guy. And it was very common that I would read a script and I would say, this is actually pretty decent writing. But, this one element that's in here makes it essentially impossible for me to produce. And it's not something that is like an insurmountable obstacle. Like, you could rewrite it and fix it probably. But, that's not what the script is. I have this script in front of me. I'm not going to buy this script. I'm going to read the next script that, hopefully is going to fit into the boxes that I need kind of checked off. And it's a lot of stuff that isn't necessarily intuitive. And I think, it's something that's very difficult for me to, like, unless you actually did what I did, which is basically do this every day for years and constantly have the conversation with the foreign sales agent and with the producers and with the line producers and the budget and tax credits and, all these different things. Unless you actually did that all the time, it's tough to just have that knowledge. You just can't, and I would often think, man, if I actually had this writer sitting next to me, I could just explain to him, like, hey, if you just change this one thing, this would be a lot more producer friendly. Like, it'd be a lot more attractive to me. Mm-hmm. And so that's essentially the kernel of this thing that you and I started talking about, is like, that might be a service that's actually useful to writers and gives them some of this kind of behind the curtain practical knowledge that is helpful ultimately to the writers and the producers.
Yeah. So just quickly, you mentioned about, a script checking these certain boxes that you needed checked. Maybe you can just talk about what some of those boxes actually are.
Right. So, an example that we had chatted about that I wanted to bring up is actually a script that I wrote a while back, and I actually think it's a pretty good script. Like, we almost made the cut in nickel with it. Like, they actually sent us a little note saying, hey, you literally missed the cut by like 20 scripts. Like, we really like the script. Mm-hmm. And it has actually been optioned, and it's had interest, and, we kind of have had some people kind of poke around at it, but I think the reason why we have not.
And maybe we can, I have the log line in front of me, and so maybe we can just talk about that, because I think you're going to get into some specifics here, and it might be worth just actually telling the log line. I can read it. If you have it, you can read it.
Yeah. So basically, it's a script. It's about an amnesiac, and he basically wakes up in the middle of nowhere, doesn't know who he is, and he finds out that he's wanted for murder, and he genuinely does not know whether or not he committed the murder. So he actually starts investigating, but as he's investigating, he doesn't know if he is investigating himself and he committed the crime, or if he was a victim of the real killer, and that's who he's trying to find. And so gradually he starts remembering stuff, and it basically goes from there. But it's essentially a mystery. I mean, it's basically a straight mystery, right? And it's a funny thing because, and I think it speaks to the point of this whole service. Creatively, like we were happy with the script, and we've had a lot of feedback that people have enjoyed the script. And so we sort of know that the script, at least on some level, works creatively. But what I didn't know, and I ended up finding this out like directly because we actually, we had a conversation about it at my company. Like we actually sat down and said, okay, if we were going to make this, how would we go about doing it? And, me as the head of development, I actually agreed that we shouldn't do it. At the end of the day, after we talked through, I understood the business realities of it. Even though creatively I was like, oh man, what a shame. But once we actually talked it through and I understood all the reasons why, I was like, yeah, I get where you're coming from. Essentially, if something is a straight mystery, right, it's not really a thriller. It's not really an action movie. It's just kind of a mystery, right? So that means that you can't really sell it the way that you would an action movie in the foreign market. Now, if it's a studio movie, it's a whole different conversation because there's what's called P&A behind it, and they can make it for a much bigger budget. They can put a huge star in it. But this premise is not a studio premise. There have been way too many movies that have been guy wakes up in the middle of nowhere, doesn't remember who he is. It's just too familiar of a premise. It doesn't have the conceptual kind of heft to it that you would need for a studio feature. So that's off the table, right? So now you're down to independent film. So if an independent producer is going to make this, because it's not action and it's also not, it's not like a thriller or anything kind of direct like that, I've essentially cut out probably like 60% of producers, right? Because they can't sell it the way that they would sell those more commercial genres. So then it becomes almost like a drama where you have to essentially overcast it to get the money to make it. And one of the things that makes it a little bit easier to produce would be if you could do it for a lower budget. But we wrote it with an extremely specific setting that will be very difficult to duplicate. Like this town in Alaska, and they have like stilts beneath the houses. Like we put that in the script, like that which is like it's based on like a real town. And then we also had this like intersecting narrative that was in New York, and there's a scene in Central Park. They like row a boat onto the lake at Central Park and things like that. It just the intersection between the budget of it and the place where it naturally just goes to in terms of how you would produce it, those didn't line up. And so even though I still genuinely think it's a cool script, and I hope we find somebody that we can actually still sell to, I understand that we made it a lot harder on ourselves just because we didn't know that all this stuff was something that would make it more difficult to produce.
Yeah. And a lot of the things you're saying, like the Alaska and the Central Park, for a studio film, that's no problem at all. There have been lots of studio films in Alaska and Central Park. So as a writer, if you're not really understanding where this script is potentially going to land, and for all the reasons you just said, is this really a studio film? It just doesn't have the heft, I think is a good word that you used. It doesn't really have the heft for a studio film. And so you're going to have to do it independently. And it has too many, it's just the budget would never work on
right.
going
so,
to Alaska.
What ends up being is, and it's actually ironically, many of the scripts that I would read that I could not pursue because I could see they weren't practical. It essentially is something that has to go to somebody who has equity, that just has money and can just go make the movie. And then once the movie is made, great, right? But the thing is, there's so much fewer buyers in that are in that situation. And I think that most writers, when they sit down and write something, they just assume that it's going to be a studio movie. And I think that the amount of pressure on the concept is something that people just fundamentally are reluctant to think about. I know I was, as a writer, I would just sit down and like, hey, I'll just write a good script. We'll see what happens, you know. But it's not necessarily that simple.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so the last point about this particular movie is if you were to do it over again, maybe you can just give us some quick tips of how you would maybe, if you were starting from scratch now, what would you do with this project?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think that it was something where we had this premise that was sort of sounds like a much more high octane kind of premise than the actual movie is. And, you know, again, it was something where we were so interested in the dramatic elements of the story that we really kind of focus on that. So it would be a cool, like, kind of drama mystery movie. But in terms of the commercial appeal of it, you know, we probably would have had to make it a lot more action oriented and more of like an action movie that has kind of a cool, you know, role for an actor and has some wavy themes about identity and things like that, you know. But you gotta get in that kind of commercial part of it. Otherwise, it just becomes tough.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, again, so we're gonna figure out all the details on this, and then I'm gonna post a link in the show notes. So if anybody wants to learn more about this product, because essentially the product is gonna be you doing to their script exactly what you just did to your own script, giving them all of this same advice. And as I said, we'll work out the details. I'll put the link in the show notes, and if people want to learn more about that, they can find the show notes and check it out.
Cool.
Perfect. So Dan, this has been a great interview. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I learned a lot. So I know some of the listeners will as well. So I really appreciate your coming on and spending an hour with me.
Absolutely, man. Thanks.
So perfect. Thank you. We'll talk to you later.
All right. Bye-bye.
I just want to mention two things I'm doing at Selling Your Screenplay to help screenwriters find producers who are looking for material. First, I've created a monthly newsletter that will be sent out directly to producers. Every member of SYS Select can submit one log line per newsletter. I went and emailed my large database of producers and asked them if they'd like to receive this monthly newsletter of pitches. So far, we have well over 200 producers who have signed up to receive it. These producers are hungry for material and happy to read scripts from new writers. So if you want to participate in this pitch newsletter and get your script into the hands of lots of producers, sign up at sellingyourscreenplay.com/select. And secondly, we've partnered with one of the premier paid screenwriting leads sites, so we can syndicate their leads to SYS Select members. There are lots of great paid leads coming in each week from our partner. Recently, we've been getting 10 to 12 high-quality paid leads per week. These are producers and production companies who are actively looking to buy material and are looking to hire a screenwriter for a specific project. If you sign up to SYS Select, you'll get all these leads emailed directly to you several times per week. These leads run the gamut from production companies looking for a specific type of spec script to producers looking to hire a screenwriter to write up one of their ideas. We have shorts, features, producers looking for TV and web series pilots. It's a huge array of different types of projects that these producers are looking for. And these leads are exclusive to our partner and to SYS Select members. To sign up, go to sellingyourscreenplay.com/select. I recently set up a success stories page for people who have had success through the various SYS Select services. So if you want to check out some of what other people who have tried our services are saying, just go to sellingyourscreenplay.com/success. Also, if you had success with any of the SYS services, please do let me know. It's inspiring to hear these success stories, and I'd love to share your story and perhaps even have you on the podcast for an interview just to kind of get a feel for how you did succeed. You can always email me, info@sellingyourscreenplay.com. So next week, on the podcast, I'm going to be interviewing Andrew Haig about his new indie drama called 45 Years. It's a very intimate look at an older couple's 45 years of marriage. If you're looking to have a career writing and directing art house films, his career is probably a pretty good template to look at. And next week will be the last episode of the year as well. I'll be taking off a week between Christmas and New Year's. So next week I'm also going to be doing a wrap up of kind of what I've done this year and some of the lessons that I've learned. So happy holidays. And as I said, last week will be the last episode of the year. So keep an eye out for that next week. To wrap things up, I just want to touch on a few things from today's interview with Dan. To me, there's a couple big takeaways from the interview. I actually think what Dan is doing is probably the highest percentage play to become a professional screenwriter. I've talked about this before around episode number 75 of the podcast. I went and I tallied up how most people who I had interviewed had broken in. I'll link to it in the show notes. But I basically just created a list. I listed each podcast episode and then listed exactly how they had broken in. And then I tallied up the results. The overwhelming way people broke into the business was networking. And under that very broad term of networking, there was a sort of a sub-term was working in the business. And that was by far the biggest group of people who were networking, working in the business was the single biggest way of breaking in. So I really think getting firsthand knowledge of the entertainment business really is probably the single biggest thing, the single best thing you can do to help yourself in your screenwriting career. I talk a lot on this podcast about doing shorts to get your career started, and I reiterate that. I think that's a great avenue. That's something Dan did in film school. He worked on a bunch of shorts. But I think combining that with working in the industry is a great 1-2 punch. And again, this is kind of what Dan's doing. He had a lot of practical production experience through film school. He had made a feature film, entered it into some film festivals. So he had a little bit of experience on that end. And then he combined it with this experience of actually working in the industry for a few years. Last week, I had Jared Frieder on the podcast, and he was winning contests, and he was also working in the industry. So again, he had this great 1-2 punch of working two angles. Take note also of what Dan said about how the two of us met. I think it's worth noting. He went and he contacted everyone he knew and just offered to buy them lunch. That's exactly what he did with me. He emailed me, said, hey, I'm going to start being a full-time screenwriter. You want to get together lunch? Me, and I'm sure a lot of other people said, sure. So I met up with him. We talked, and that's a very powerful thing because he had been working in the industry for quite a long time, and he knows a lot of people from this experience. So I'm sure there was dozens of these lunch meetings, and you just never know where those are going to end up. I mean, through that meeting with me, he ended up using my email and fax blast service, and ended up selling a script. So, those meetings that's a very clear, you can clearly trace that to, actually selling something. But there's a lot of subtlety in a lot of these meetings, and some of these things will pay dividends for years down the road. So that's a powerful tool, and that's a real, firsthand, concrete example of how working in the industry can be so powerful for you. Also, listen to what Dan said about not saying no to anyone and working on a ton of projects while he was in film school. He just had that attitude. He's just not going to say no to anybody. He just wants to work and learn. And that's the sort of attitude that you need. You need to be willing and able to work on a ton of projects to the point where you don't even know how you're going to get them all done. I do that. I try and talk about some of them on the podcast just to give you an idea of what all I've got going. And I've had several conversations with Dan outside of the podcast, so I know that's what he's doing too. He's got a ton of irons in the fire, a lot of stuff we didn't even talk about on the podcast. He's just working a ton of different angles, trying to get some things going. And that's just what you've got to do. I would say this goes all the way up to the highest levels of screenwriters and producers and directors and just being in the entertainment industry, all the way up to a guy like Spielberg. Go look up Steven Spielberg's resume. He's producing this, executive producing this. He's got TV shows. He's got movies. He's got dozens of projects that he's trying to push forward. And for every one that succeeds, he's probably got, a half dozen or a dozen that don't succeed. And this is really worth noting and worth kind of understanding that, if you have one project that you're trying to push forward, the chances of any one project actually taking off is very, very slim. So you've got to just constantly push on various projects. And as I said, that's at all levels. That's from people that are trying to break in all the way up to the highest levels. Spielberg, as I said, is probably at the highest level, and go look at his resume. He's got a million things going on, and I can assure you, for everything that he gets into production, he's got lots and lots of projects that never saw the light of day, and that's just part of the business. I hope, too, hearing interviews with guys like Dan gives you some perspective. If you're out there trying to be a screenwriter, you've got to realize that guys like me and Dan are exactly what you're competing against. We're all using Inktip. We're all using the Blacklist. We're all using my email and fax blast service. We're all in this same group. We're all out there trying to push our projects out. Really think about what you're doing and figure out how you're going to be able to out-hustle guys like me and Dan, because that's what it's going to take. There's a million guys here in Hollywood like me and Dan trying to push these things forward. So if you listen to interviews like the one I just showed you, like you just heard of Dan, and you're thinking, gee, that's amazing. He's got so many things. He's worked in the industry. He's got so many projects going. He's working on this. if you listen to this podcast and think the same thing about me, that's just what you have to do. If you're not working on as many projects as I'm working on, you're probably not really in the race. You've got to get up to speed. You've got to get a lot of these projects going and just really, really hustle. As I said, there's a lot of really, really smart people here, Dan being one of them, who are all out there hustling projects. And, he's getting projects produced. He's getting projects sold. And that's just what you've got to do. You've got to be hustling and hitting a million different angles. Once again, if you want to learn about the producer's notes that Dan is offering, check out the podcast. It's episode number 103. I will link to the landing page in the show notes. As I said in the podcast, we're still working out some of the details, pricing, and kind of exactly how it's all going to work. But go to the podcast, go to sellingascreenplay.com/podcast, look for episode 103, and then I will link to the page in the show notes so you can learn more about that. Also, one last side note, and this kind of pertains to what I was saying just a second ago. I've had a few people on the podcast over the years who have had success with my email and fax blast service, like Dan. You can go back and listen to some of those episodes, episode number 79, and I can't remember the other number. I'll try and dig it out. It was a interview with Jordan. He also sold some stuff and optioned some stuff through the email and fax blast service. So those are available. But I would say in almost all cases, the people who have had success with my email and fax blast service are people like Dan, who have some considerable experience in the industry. In fact, I can only think of 2 people who have had options that didn't have any experience in the business. This is really worth noting. And when I say experience in the business, it can mean anything. Working in the industry like Dan, and also doing shorts and a feature film, also like what Dan did, or having previous options or sales, or again, having a track record of doing a bunch of shorts. Almost all the people that have success with my email and fax blast service, I'm just going to reiterate that, almost all the people who have success with email and fax blast service have a track record of actually doing some of these things that we're talking about: shorts, doing an independent feature film, working in the industry. Experience counts. This is worth noting because anybody can get the experience that I'm talking about. These entry-level jobs, Dan just described how he got this entry-level job last week with Jared Frieder. He described how he got the entry-level job. If you're young and fresh out of college, you can get those entry-level jobs. They're not going to be easy, but you can get those. You can get that experience. Same thing with doing shorts. If you, for whatever reason, you're not in a position where you can go and work in an entry-level job in the entertainment industry, I certainly understand that. But you can go and you can work on these shorts, and you can build a resume of shorts that you have written and produced. And again, that will build up your experience level. And it's hard to quantify exactly why. Like, it's hard to point to some specific thing. Obviously, in Dan's case, he's worked in development, so he understands kind of what producers are looking for. That's invaluable experience. But as I said, a lot of the people that have had success with the email and fax blast service also have done some shorts. And I just think that they're just getting experience, seeing your projects actually filmed, seeing actors interpret your dialogue. All these things sort of add up very subtly. They add up to experience that helps you write a better script. And that's really ultimately what I think it is. I think the people that have experience are typically writing better scripts, and that's why they're having more success with my email and fax blast service. But anybody can get that experience. And so starting at the bottom and trying to get that experience, I think, is really worth doing. My guess is the same thing for the Blacklist and the same thing for Inktip. My guess is if you looked at the people that were having the most success on those services, they probably had some other things going for them. They were working in the industry, or they had done some shorts or something else. My guess is it would extend out to those other services, because it's all the same. It's basically the same people are using all of these services. So again, it's really worth thinking about how you're going to get this experience, and perhaps go out there and actually make some shorts. Again, see if you can get that low-level job in the industry. Definitely check out that post that I wrote as I said, I think it's about the first 75 episodes where I tallied up people. Check that post out, because there you can actually look and see, well, how did this person break in? And you can probably find sort of a method that will work for you. Everybody's situation is different. And as I said, I understand some people can't work in the industry, but everybody has different ways of breaking in. So go look at that post. You can kind of figure out, okay, this is how people have broken in. And then hopefully you can build a template based on some of these other people's experiences, build a template that is going to work for your particular circumstances. Anyway, that's the show. Thank you for listening.